I don't do it very often because I don't consider myself very good at it. But I am going to start off today with a joke. Actually, two jokes. I usually have a hard time remembering jokes, but this one first came to me from Don Franklin. He is a quiet and gentle man from one of my previous churches. It would seem that one Sunday the devil decided to pay a personal visit to this church. Not this church, but to the church, to a church. The devil walked in the door and he marched his way right down the center aisle to the very front. And he was so obviously the devil that folks nearly trampled one another trying to get out of the building. All except this one little old lady sitting on the front pew. And the devil said to her, "Lady, how come you're still here?" She replied, "Because I ain't scared of you." The devil said, "You ain't scared? Don't you know who I am?" And she said, "Sure, I know who you are. I've been married to your brother for 47 years. The other one is about a clever preacher, if you can imagine such a thing. The preacher was approached by two men who offered the preacher $1,000 to preach their brother's funeral. It was a reasonable and manageable request, except for the fact that the deceased had not been a very nice man. It was widely known among everyone in the community that this man was chief among sinners of the town. The brothers stipulated that in the eulogy, the preacher needed to paint this man as a saint. Well, on the day of the funeral, the preacher got up to the podium and he said, "Harvey was a drunk. He was a cheat. He was a thief and a real scoundrel. But in comparison to his brothers, he was a saint." Both of those jokes come to my mind when I read the scripture from this morning that Mary just read for us. Now, I'm not sure that Jesus isn't himself telling a joke in this parable. You know, sometimes humor is the best way to deliver a serious point. Amen. There's no way around it. In print, this story, followed by Luke's recollection of Jesus' explanation of the story, makes for some confusing reading. The confusing part is that Jesus would tell us a story in which a dishonest manager is commended and admired for his less than ethical behavior, followed by Jesus lifting up the importance of faithfulness and honesty in even small decisions. On the surface, it seems sort of contradictory. Perhaps a better way to describe it would be the word paradox. Do you know that word? A paradox, Mr. Webster says, is a tenet contrary to received opinion, a statement that is seemingly contradictory or opposed to common sense, and yet is perhaps true. The manager in Jesus' story is a paradox. He is obviously not someone we would want to take on as a business partner. He's not someone we would necessarily want our daughter to marry. You probably would not want him to be sent to you by the Methodist Conference as your preacher or elect him as your representative to Congress. Well, you may have already done that. We might be tempted to call him, like the deceased man in the joke, a scoundrel. He's a shyster. He's a no-good-ski. And be done with him. Why in the world would Jesus use such a character like this guy to try and teach us something? This may be the toughest parable Jesus ever told. St. Augustine said about this parable, "I can't believe this story came from the lips of our Lord." Some scholars say that Luke himself had trouble with the story, and that Luke seemed to have added a few clarifying verses at the end of the story. For Luke has Jesus say, "We cannot love God and we cannot love money." True, but that doesn't really relate to the parable. And Luke also has Jesus warning us to be careful of the one who is not faithful in small things, because that person will not be faithful in big things. And that's also true, but really it doesn't address the scandal here. What the manager did, I should say, what he did was dishonest. And what Jesus did was to praise him for his dishonesty. What are we to make of that? Along come the learned scholars, and through many contortions, they attempt to make this parable make sense. In the usual ways we make sense, they explain that perhaps the parable is hyperbole. It's some overstatement. It's some exaggeration which Jesus uses to get our attention. Now I'm a preacher, and I've been known to overstate things sometimes, but I don't think I've ever have tried to get your attention by urging you to steal. What is up with this story? What is it with this guy that Jesus finds worthy to lift up? What, if anything, does this guy have to teach upstanding, decent, honest, responsible, respectable church people? That we are, right? Can we find anything redeeming in this guy? It's hard for us. It is hard for us to look beyond this guy's sleazy ways to find something redeeming here. But Jesus does. It reminds me of a gospel song. He looked beyond my sin and saw my need. And in this case, Jesus looks beyond this man's sin, and he sees his gifts. Strip away for a moment this man's unscrupulous methods, and what we find is a man who is willing to step up and take on the question, what's next? The man has no doubt gotten himself into a pickle. Have you ever gotten yourself into a pickle? He's lost his job. But he doesn't just plant himself on his pity pot and find every excuse in the book to justify why he's stuck in his current state. He does not expect others to go out there and fix it for him. Rather, the man asks himself the question, well, what's next then? And he starts working toward a different future. It has been my experience that we oftentimes don't want to face that question, what next? We much prefer focusing on what was, what's been. Now, there's nothing wrong with remembering and celebrating history, learning from the past. Very important, very necessary. But if our whole focus, if our primary focus is on what was and what has been, to the point that we ignore or we avoid what's next, well then what's the future going to be? You know, in general, I would say young people are better at this than we elders are. The question of what next. They're not afraid to ask that question and reflect on it. That's why I believe we desperately need young people in our churches, don't we? We need them to be involved in the decision-making activity of our churches. For in all likelihood, they have more of a vested interest in how that question is answered than we who have more snow on the roof or less grass on the hilltop. So what is next? The question challenges us to take our heads out of the sand or other places we have put our heads and examine the realities of the present and look toward the future. The question is both an appropriate question and it's an important question for us to ask in every aspect of our lives. In our own lives as individuals, if we have a partner, with our partners, with our families, as parents, as employees, and as church family, what's next? The dishonest manager, for all his character deficiencies, is not afraid to ask the question, I've been fired. Okay, I've been fired. Well, what next? United Bishop Will Willimon retells the parable of Jesus in this way. He said, once upon a time there was a rich man who got word that the manager was pilfering from him, so he summoned this little guy in for an audit. What's this I hear about what you've done with my money? Show me the books. Well, boss, nothing would please me more than to show you the books, but I need to do a few calculations. Well, the little weasel thinks to himself, I'm too proud to beg, and I'm too weak to do any real work. Well, what am I to do? Well, let's see. I'll call in my master's debtors, and I'll have them write down their debts, and they'll be so grateful that when my master fires me, I can go to them for help. And thus the swindle begins. Each of the debtors called in and asked, you owe the master $1,000? Well, let's mark that down to $250. How you like them numbers? Huge sums of money are written off. And then comes the day of judgment. Now the little wretch will get what his thievery deserves, right? The dishonest manager presents the cooked books to the master, and the master responds, well, you genius, you. Wow. What wonderful initiative. What commercial creativity. What innovative bookkeeping. I wish all my people were as smart in looking after their future. Well, now that's shrewd, isn't it? How shrewd can we be? Let's face it. Some of us don't do shrewd very well. Oh, we do polite really good, don't we? We do steady and stable and dependable great. We're good at that. And all of those are incredibly valuable qualities that the world absolutely needs to get along. But when it comes to shrewd, sometimes the devil's team has us followers of Jesus beat. For the work of God's kingdom is too important, though, for us to give up, to lessen our efforts and potentially lose our impact. Maybe this parable is really a reminder to all the good church people, including good church people right here among us, that we learn something from those who walk the streets of the neighborhood. Well, I'll be honest with you. I find the activities of those who stand on the sidewalks peddling drugs, or promoting prostitution, or painting gang symbols on buildings, or stealing copper from church air conditioning units, I find that behavior repulsive. And in no way can that sort of activity, which destroys the peace of the community, be defended or excused, or those who do those things not be held accountable. So when I say what I'm about to say, please do not hear me as glorifying a life of sinful behavior. But we have to admit, some of us, that those who are living the street life and the ways of the street life are sometimes more persistent than those of us who are trying to be respectable and upstanding. Sometimes the disciples of the street life are finding ways to connect with and appeal to our youth, which we are not finding as the church. And I have learned that there is among the disciples of the street life those who are quite shrewd. And there are those who benefit financially from the activities of the street, who may never step foot into our neighborhoods, they're even more shrewd. The message of this parable to me is that as the Church of Jesus Christ, as disciples of Jesus, we need to be asking this question: what's next? We don't need to be dwelling on what was. And we had better be putting as much, if not more, energy and time and resources and resolve into doing good and claiming the youth of our community into our camp. We had better be willing to get out there and get our hands a little bit dirty and start planting some seeds in the places where weeds can quickly grow, or we're going to find those weeds spreading right across into our well-manicured lawns.
Amen.
We have to make the world of God-wise more attractive and convincing than the world of street-wise.
Amen.
And we have to start early, and we have to stay at it longer. The greatest tool of the devil is the impatience of Jesus' disciples. We give up too soon, don't we, on people? We give up too soon. Well, we tried that. We put out a few flyers and we had an event and nobody came except those who already come. So I guess we just ought to circle the wagons and keep the campfire burning here as long as we can. Sing the same camp songs we've always sung until we can't keep the camp up any longer. Should that be the philosophy of God's people? No. Certainly it's not how Jesus said to do things. Jesus says, get out there and try something new. Try something different. Create community with those whose ways may not be our ways, but nonetheless may know some ways to bring the good news to the streets where bad news is often ruling the day. What's next? If people who claim to walk in the light, the sunlight, the S-O-N sunlight, if we're not working on the answer to that question, what's next? Well, we can be sure those who are determined to increase the darkness are working on it. What's next? What's next for you? What's next for us as God's people? Some of you here today, I'm not going to point you out or make you stand up, but I'm about to give you a compliment. Some of you here today have incredible survival skills, which amaze me. I've often said this: I'm a baby, I'll admit it. I'm not sure I'd survive a day on the streets. Now, I have much to give to the world to make the world a better place. I do. I'm compassionate, I'm responsible, I'm committed, I have lots of love in my heart. And you, all of you, have much to give to the world to make the world a better place. Amen. Some of you have ingenuity, along with your survival skills. Some of you are quite creative. Some of you can tell a convincing story. I know that. I've been taken in by some of your stories. Some of you can work the system, play it like a fiddle. Some of you have observation skills that the CIA could use. Amen. Some of you are great at taking a little and making a lot. Amen. There are gifts out there on the streets, are there not? Amen. What if those gifts were directed toward the work of God's kingdom? Amen. What if those gifts were combined with other gifts like responsibility and hard work and compassion and faithfulness and truth and love? I believe if we could bring all those gifts together, we could turn this neighborhood around. What if we all joined Jesus' team? Yeah. What would happen then to